everyone. Welcome to the Central Library of Rochester and Monroe County. My name is Emily Morey, and I am the assistant editor of the Rochester History Journal. And I want to welcome all of you here, as well as our live streaming audience, to today's program, Exploring Blake McKelvey's Rochester Legacy. Just a couple housekeeping notes. The restrooms are located just to the left of us, so just hang a left as you leave the auditorium door. Secondly, we have a table set up from RIT Press where you can purchase copies of or subscribe to Rochester History with Keiner at the back there. And our latest issue, which is featured on the table, features a forum exploring the life and legacy of former city historian Blake McKelvey. As historian Nancy Hewitt mentions in her introduction, Blake McKelvey is Rochester history. After all, the guy literally wrote the book on it, several books in fact, and this year marks the 80th anniversary of the first such book, Rochester, the Water Power City, 1812 to 1854. This is the first book in what would be a 4-volume series exploring Rochester's rise from a settlement to a technological powerhouse. But beyond the immeasurable influence McKelvey had on Rochester history, he also helped define the field of urban history as well as the role of a city historian. So in honor of this anniversary moment, we have gathered multiple voices to reflect upon and assess Blake McKelvey's legacy and his contributions not just to local history, but to urban history, public history, and environmental history. And speaking on these topics today will be the members of our esteemed panel. We have Christine L. Ridarsky, Rochester and Monroe County historian, as well as the co-editor of the Rochester History Journal. Beside her is Michael James Brown, history professor at RIT. And beside Michael, we have Catherine Keiner, who is professor and department chair of RIT's Department of Science, Technology, and Society. And we are also very pleased to have with us moderating today's event, Mr. Bruce Leslie, Professor Emeritus from SUNY Brockport. So without any further ado, please help me in welcoming our fine panelists and moderator.
Well, as Emily, can you hear me in the back? Okay. Well, as Emily said, officially I'm here as a moderator, but I think I'm really been brought in as a relic of history as it was done 50, 60 years ago. In fact, I overlap a bit with McKelvey. He wrote his dissertation for Arthur Schlesinger Jr., and I wrote my dissertation for one of Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s students. So we overlap. And in fact, when I came to Western New York in 1970, he was still fully officially employed, although I take it from what I've been reading, he really never retired. But although he, as Emily said, he wrote the book on Rochester history, he was also really nationally respected, and I think that's really critically important. I first heard of a Blake McKelvey in 1965. I had to do my junior research paper, and I was all fired up by the Great Society and figured, we really need to get involved before we solved all the urban problems. Turned out that wasn't a problem. But at any rate, I wanted to do something on urban education particularly, and on urbanization. And the first book that my advisor recommended was The Urbanization of America. I should say I was in New Jersey, so it wasn't local. And so he had already really played a major role in shaping urban history. And note that his 4-volume history, I have 3 of them here, which add up to something like 1,600 pages, I believe. I mean, the man had an amazing work ethic. I'd like to know his secrets. At any rate, all 4 were published by Harvard University Press, arguably the most prestigious university press in the country. And it must have been quite a selling job to do that, to get Bostonians to agree to publish on this little city out west, and just is testimony, I think, to the way he was respected professionally as well as locally. Well, it was really a journey back to read some of his reading. The Water Power book that we're celebrating the 80th anniversary of today, it really took me home again. This was what we called the new social history. I feel a bit old thinking the new social history was 60 years ago, but at any rate. And it was a history that more inelegantly been called history from the bottom up. Perhaps we could have done it with a better label. But a history using particularly social science, using, when we can still read economic history, what was it, all numbers, sociology, anthropology. And the topics of greatest interest were ethnicity, and the older use of the word meaning European ethnicity, religion, working class culture. Those are the focus, and correspondingly relatively weak on African Americans, on women or gender as a variable, and on the physical environment. Statistics were crucial to the new social history, and I think Blake McKelvey used them extremely well. Didn't have nearly the access that today we would have with computers and the internet and so on, but he made extremely good use, I thought, of census, both New York State and federal, as well as city directories, a wonderful source, trade magazines, and while he didn't have the skills, he called for people to turn to the ethnic magazines and newspapers. So I would give him very high praise as a model of the history that dominated history in the 1960s and 70s and into the 80s. He really was an exemplar of new social history more broadly, as well as of urban history. But we lacked something today that is so important: public history. I think the word had not even been invented yet. I'm not sure, but I don't believe so. And there was no greater insult in our seminars than to accuse someone of being antiquarian. And I think, if we're honest, we were really a bit disdainful of local historians, county historians, of local history. But McKelvey is not guilty of that. He really straddled the professional with the civic commitment, and somehow how he did it all, I can't imagine. I say, these were 1,600 pages right there, and he wrote a lot else, and had a deep commitment to the Rochester community. So I think it's appropriate if I hand it over to one of his successors, Ridarsky.
Hello? Okay. Hi. Thank you. So, as Professor Leslie just mentioned, I currently serve as both your Rochester City Historian and more recently also as your County Historian. Blake McKelvey was one of the earliest historians in New York State, and there's something unique about him. And how many of you know about New York's historian law? 1, 2, 3. Oh, only 4. Very few. So New York State is the only state in the country that has a law on the books that requires that every municipality and later every county have an actual appointed historian. So those of us who are appointed government historians, we are government officials. We serve at taxpayer expense to support all of you and our government. This is very unique, and Blake McKelvey is someone who really set the standard for what that means. So Blake McKelvey, as Dr. Leslie has mentioned, was trained as an academic historian, as was I, but he served in this role that became what we today call public history. For me, public history is really important because if you think about the way most people learn history, and I know I'm looking at an audience, I see some scholars in the room, but most people learn history through their introduction in their educational formative years. Most of that focuses on national and world issues, not so much at the local level. Here in New York State, our fourth graders do study some New York State history. The Erie Canal is part of that. But for the most part, it's a pretty surface level introduction to American history. The other ways that most of us get our history is through visits to museums, through film, and these days through through social media. So the role that a public historian plays, in my eyes, is one of bridging the work that academics like my colleagues here are doing with sort of the people living in the real world who are not necessarily going to read even a tome like Blake McKelvey's, right? And you know, there was a day, these histories that Blake McKelvey wrote were written for a public audience. And that's where he sort of bridged that place between academic history and public history. Of course, we know today most people aren't going to read that kind of thing. So that's where the way that the public consumes history has changed very much from McKelvey's day. So I like to think of myself as a bridge, helping sort of everyday Americans and Rochesterians to understand their history. And I hope to take that beyond the surface level that so many of us get through other sources. So I think I'll leave it at that for now, and we can come back to other questions. So next is Michael.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out on a sunny Saturday. As a Rochesterian, I'm very attuned to singular claims about Rochester. So for many years, I believed, as I was told, that only the Genesee and the Nile were northward flowing rivers, which is very wrong, but I wanted to believe, and for about a decade I did. I've also been told that the garbage plate is the most cholesterol-rich dish in the history of human nourishment. I'm not sure. I suppose it's possible to exceed it with, if you sort of ate Crisco, I suppose you would exceed it. But I collect these claims that distinguish Rochester. And one of them comes from Blake McKelvey. Blake McKelvey arrived here in 1936, and in 1989 he was looking back on his career, and he doesn't seem anything other than a modest person. And so this was particularly striking given his personality. He said that he had produced the only complete historical biography of a city yet written in America or abroad. I thought, that's stunning. That's stunning. There is only one complete history of a city out there, and it's of Rochester. It's of our city. How did this happen? Why Rochester? Why not New York City or London or Tokyo or some other great metropolis of the world? And then I wondered, what is a biography of a city? I know about a biography of a life, but a city contains many lives. How can you do a biography of it? And then I thought about the word complete. What is the complete history of a thing? Even if the biography was of an individual's life, what would be your complete biography? Would it be the number of seconds that you used each morning that you brushed your teeth during your entire life? Would that be data that should be statistically compiled for the sake of completeness? What is the standard of completeness for something like a city? So my article set out to explore these questions in the context of McKelvey's career and in the context of some of the larger developments in writing about city history and doing public history that Bruce and Christine talked about. And I found that there were some moments in Blake McKelvey's life that signaled perhaps how he came to this notion of writing a complete history of Rochester. One is this kind of visual way he had of looking at cities. He speaks of growing up in Pennsylvania, and he's growing up in the sort of mountainous middle of Pennsylvania in a town called Huntington on the Juniata River. And he gets on the bluffs above the town and with his father as a child, and he sees the whole town from one perspective. Then he moves to Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and again he says he took his bike, and having driven many times up and down Route 15 to my partner Esther's family in the DC area, I love that kind of viewing station after you've crossed the river heading south. You're on your way toward Reptile World, is soon to arrive, and there's a kind of viewing pull-off on Route 15 where you're on the high ground, and then you can really see all of Williamsport. And then he talks about coming to Rochester for what seems to be his job interview with the city. And of course he goes up to Cobb's Hill, and he looks over the city of Rochester, and he sees that it's a city, he says, of homeowners, and that there are a few smokestacks and steeples visible above this tree canopy. So this is a person who recurs to this idea that there's one perspective that an individual can attain, allowing that individual to see the whole thing entirely. I extrapolate from that to think that maybe he thought that the historian was this kind of floating eyeball, and this was before the invention of the drone made that sort of seem possible, who could see a thing entire. And yet how flawed that belief is. How much we're not seeing when we're at Cobb's Hill looking at the city of Rochester. We don't see into homes, we don't see into mines, we don't see into all these important things. So this kind of idea that he had, that you could see a city whole from one perspective. And then he has this perspective of being a historian, and as Bruce said, he ended up at Harvard with Arthur Schlesinger Sr., not to be confused with the more famous Schlesinger Jr., who was sort of JFK's amanuensis and was kind of a glamorous historian a public historian in the way of being kind of in the society pages in the 60s. And Schlesinger Sr. Is very important for moving beyond what he called drum and trumpet versions of history. The history of so-called statesmen and statecraft. And Schlesinger says, my God, that leaves out the great mass of humanity. And intellectually, to understand history, we need to understand the great mass of humanity. And you get the sense that there's a moral move to recognize a broader spectrum of human history as well. And so Blake McKelvey is at Harvard when Schlesinger is working on his book, The Rise of the City. And Schlesinger would think that to get away from this drum and trumpet history and to cover society, to do social history, would be to focus on the city. And Schlesinger had taken that professorship at Harvard over from Frederick Jackson Turner, who is famous for his frontier thesis, that the crucible of American democracy is the frontier, that shapes American character. And Schlesinger and McKelvey say, no, it's the city. Because the city is this meeting ground, the city is this contested space, the city is crowded. That's where kind of American democracy is being made. McKelvey finishes his PhD. It's the depths of the Great Depression. And like many of us with history PhDs, he needs a job and some way to pay rent. And he connects with a New Deal project surveying historical documents in the state of Pennsylvania. And so this is another big element, is kind of the bureaucratization of the historical field with multi-person, multi-year projects to gather all the sources on everything. And again, to contribute to this illusion that with these multi-year, multi-person projects, we can get all the sources. All the sources can be collected, and once they're collected, you can scale that mountain of sources and see the thing entirely from this mass of sources that you've collected. He goes from there to Chicago, where at the University of Chicago, another Schlesinger-trained historian, Bessie Louise Pierce, is doing a multi-volume, exhaustive, soup-to-nuts history of the city of Chicago, and he works on that. And that's where Blake McKelvey really becomes an urban historian for the first time and develops some of the methods he'll use for Rochester. So he, in his 4-volume Rochester, produced this only complete history. But before he did that, he worked on another effort to do such a thing for an even larger city, Chicago. He arrived in Rochester in 1936 and lived in Rochester until his death in the year 2000. And that's another distinctive thing, is his long duration in Rochester involved with Rochester history, 64 years. And so this idea that this is a gargantuan labor to write a complete history of a place, to gather all the sources, to process them, to assimilate them, and that it requires somebody who starts young and works and is fortunate enough to live into old age and is working on the project that entire time. And that the city is not New York, London, or Tokyo. It's this modest metropolis of Rochester, creating a possibility of knowing the thing whole. As I got to the end of this consideration, I realized that McKelvey wanted to make a history that was complete because he thought that would be the most useful history to the people of Rochester. Which raises a question that I hope you will help us answer is, what kind of history is useful to the people of a city? What kind of historical understanding and awareness is useful to you as Rochesterians?
Hi everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah, that was really marvelous. I'm thinking of all these other things I want to write about now. I'm very honored to be part of this forum. When I learned last summer that Rochester History Journal was planning a special issue on Blake McKelvey's book, The Water Power City, I was instantly intrigued because I've always wondered about why he chose that title for this book. Why didn't he call it The Flour City? Flour as in the milling of wheat for bread production that of course led to Rochester's huge rise as a boom town, the young lion of the West, of course, in association with the rise of the Erie Canal. Why did he choose to title the book, this first in the 4 series, The Water Power City? So that has always stood out to me as an environmental historian. Environmental historians are interested in the relationships between people and their environments and how they've changed over time. And this is a relatively new field of inquiry. It grew out of the fields of social history in the mid-20th century. So the idea that we shouldn't just be focusing on elite members of past societies, not just the kings and the presidents, looking at regular people and non-human entities as well. So in addition, as a strong environmentalist, I'm very concerned about living in a warming world, living in a world where water crises are becoming more and more prevalent. And that's why I opened the article by saying that even those of us living in the Great Lakes region, we can no longer take the abundance of water for granted. And I really like the concept of water blindness. This is a term coined by a Norwegian geographer historian, Geert Tvedt, in 2007. And he's written a lot about how water blindness has characterized modernity. And we can't be in that stage anymore. We have to recognize that water crises, from droughts and floods to contamination and pollution are something that all societies have to deal with, including here in our so-called climate haven of the Great Lakes region. So the fact that Blake McKelvey did not have water blindness, back in the 1930s and 40s, this really stood out to me. So I structured my article around a pioneering article that came out in the 1990s, looking at how environmental history and urban history can come together. And Michael's talk also reminded me, going all the way back to the frontier thesis of Frederick Jackson Turner, in many ways the field of environmental history is kind of a challenge against Turner's ideas. So Turner believed that, like, to understand democracy, you have to understand the idea of the frontier, a place where there aren't people, where there are natural resources that have not yet been exploited, and environmental historians would say, well, there is no such place as a frontier. That humans have been living all over the place for hundreds of thousands of years. So that was one of the parts of the book that I started with, like, some concerning from a modern perspective of analyses of how McKelvey looked at the indigenous people of the Rochester region. I called the book Nature Carves a Choice Urban Site. That's one of the section titles in his first chapter. And he kind of has this idea that nature and providence somehow constructed the environment of Rochester to be perfectly fit for the Yankees of New England moving westward. And he does have a little bit about the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people of this region, but he talks about them like as a people of the past, as in terms of antiquities. Definitely not the way that scholars write about indigenous people today. So I looked at the ways in which he was very prescient in terms of looking at relationships between Rochesterians and their environments, how he brought in stories of like the cholera epidemics of the 19th century, and of course the Erie Canal, and he starts to get in the reasons why water power, of course, was so important for flour milling, but then later the dominant industrial activity switched to nurseries and horticultural. In other words, the flower city, F-L-O-W-E-R. So I look at all the ways in which his scholarship still has a lot to tell us today in terms of new areas of investigation. I think I'll leave it there for now. Oh, also just to say another reason why it's so intriguing that he did not suffer from water blindness way back before, decades before the rise of environmental history, is that even today, many environmental historians have water blindness. The people in my field, my subfield, marine environmental history, our joke is that our acronym is MEH, M-E-H, because we're always fighting to get stories about oceans and lakes on the program in our own professional society. Even the Oxford Encyclopedia of Environmental History about 10 years ago did not include a chapter on watery environments. So this is another reason why I think it's so important to look back at Blake McKelvey's scholarship. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Did you want to exchange any comments before we open up to questions? I'm certainly struck by Christine. Imagined when I was in graduate school, or in most of my career. So it's fascinating. I think people often think history doesn't change, and here we are, just doing dramatic things that we wouldn't have done, or the role of public history that, as I say, I had to say, but my generation was probably basically disdainful of Anything else? Okay, can we open it up to your questions? Michael has particularly raised the question, I think, of what kinds of history do you want? How can we as historians serve you? Okay. Oh, okay. I was going to get my stuff.
Thanks for being here and talking about McKelvey. I've got my second edition of the abridged Growth of a City. He took those 4 volumes and scooched them down into about 300, 400 pages. And as a teacher in the city school district for 35 years, every time we dealt with a new chronological period that we were studying in class, I always grabbed this well-weathered thing off the shelf to see if I can find some sort of local connection that I could plug my students into, whether it's about the New Deal or whether it was about World War II efforts, recruitment or whatever. And McKelvey's, it's kind of, a lot of it's, he's not the greatest stylist. A lot of it reads like kind of, there's a cataloging going on, but having those sources there and having them been examined with some degree of academic historian rigor, some degree of rigor, so that I knew I wasn't just looking at someone's collection that they had, oh, these are the clippings I found in my grandmother's attic, but it was someone who knew how to put that stuff into context. Every time I got to a new topic for my students, I found McKelvey absolutely invaluable to point to a geographic location that my students knew and connect it to the period of history that we were studying. And in answer to Professor Brown's question, that is, as an educator, has been incredibly useful. I don't know how many other people are using it that way, but Christine's continuing work and each issue of Rochester History Quarterly, which I think McKelvey started. Didn't he start Rochester History? So that is incredibly valuable to anyone trying to engage people in studying history by dramatically bringing the local connections into focus. So that's less of a question than a potential answer to Professor Brown's question. But I'd be interested to hear what the panelists to say about that.
Yes, thank you for those comments, and thank you for bringing up that McKelvey was the founder of the Rochester History Journal that we continue to publish to this day. And that really gets at that connection that McKelvey made between his academic studies and the issue of public history. So he knew in part that, you know, he was writing this academic tome, 4 of them, on Rochester, but he also really wanted to make sure that the public was being engaged with his work. And so in 1939, he was still the assistant city historian at that point. McKelvey was actually the 3rd historian, you might even say the 4th historian that the city has had. The historian's law was passed by New York State in 1919, and at that point every municipality was supposed to appoint a historian. Very few were that quick about it, but Rochester was among the very first in the state to take this requirement very seriously and to appoint a historian. So the first historian was a gentleman by the last name of Adler, who only served a few months before he left the city. And then they appointed someone who was an attorney who had worked for the city and an amateur historian who was president of the Historical Society. And so our very first, the person I would credit as being the first historian was Edward Foreman. And he had sort of an antiquarian approach to history and had written quite a lot of history and done it quite well for the period. But then Dexter Perkins came along, and after Foreman died suddenly, they needed to find another historian. And here you had this, nationally acclaimed historian right here at the University of Rochester, and so the city turned to him and asked him if he would be the historian. And he said yes, but he wasn't about to give up his position at the university, and so he made a very strong argument that he was going to need an assistant historian. So Dexter Perkins served as historian, but Blake McKelvey occupied the historian's office. Dexter served in a part-time capacity. McKelvey was hired on to be a full-time historian. And I think for any of us who have looked at the history of Rochester and the history of the historian's office, Dexter Perkins, I think, was historian in title only. McKelvey was doing all of that day-to-day work. And McKelvey's work, his office was right here in the library. He had access, because he came during the Great Depression, he had access to funds coming out of the federal government, so he oversaw people who were indexing the newspapers of the time. So, it's really, as a historian working here now, I'm very jealous because, sometimes my counterparts here will have graduate students or undergraduate students to assist them. I get none of that. But Blake McKelvey, in that capacity, was operating very much like an academic historian in that he did have access to, students, whether they were students in an academic sense or not, to help him to gather all of this information and all of these statistics, which really helped to make his later work possible. But in 1939, McKelvey was starting to produce his books, and he saw a need to be able to communicate that out more effectively to the public. He did that in many ways. He was constantly engaged with the press and was giving talks, and in those days the press would take much greater interest in the work of a historian. So if a historian was giving a talk, there was a good chance it was going to be covered in the local newspapers, and he was really cognizant of that need. He was funded by the taxpayers, and my article is entitled, History as a Municipal Enterprise. All of his work, including the research that went into these 4 books, was funded by the public. In 1939, the library had access to funds to help this historical work, and so they decided to use those funds to publish a journal. At that time, it was in a very different form than it is now. It was essentially a pamphlet that was published without all of these beautiful images, without color, but it was published in a means that was intended to get this work about Rochester's history out to a very public audience. And at that point in time, because of the funds that the library had, they were able to give these out for free in every library at taxpayer expense. Now today, prices have increased, times have changed. Unfortunately, we cannot offer the journal for free anymore, but we have still made an effort to try to make it at least accessible and affordable for the public. It is still taxpayer money. To some extent, taxpayer money funds my salary. We also have that fund that was established way back in the day that covers additional costs for publication of the journal. And so, this continues to be produced largely at taxpayer expense, and now with the partnership and support of the Rochester Institute of Technology, which is also helping to fund the journal. But we see this very much as a public service, a means of connecting Rochesterians to their history for many reasons. And we're starting to recognize some of the things that Michael brought up, that there is no singular history, right? So we have really been making an effort, at least since my time in office, to explore those issues that McKelvey did not explore or was unable to explore because of lack of sources. And we've made an effort to seek out sources that maybe he didn't have access to, or to start to interpret those sources in new ways. So, I really think that it's important to recognize McKelvey's work with the journal but his work, what he brought to the office was this academic training, academic rigor, at a time when what we considered rigor was different than it is now, but always with that purpose of connecting with the public and making people aware of their history.
The book that you have, Rochester on the Genesee, is as you said, it's the one volume distillation of the 4-volume series, and Bruce has 3 of the 4 volumes there in green. And I think of this giant funnel where McKelvey arrives in Rochester, and at the library there are all these sources. He tries to read one newspaper for every day of Rochester's history that a newspaper exists. And so he's got this funnel, or this still, that he's pouring all this into. All those sources go into those 4 volumes, and then he takes the 4 volumes and pulls it into the 1 volume that you have. And then there's kind of a coffee table book, a lovely gift for the holidays. That's a further distillation of that. And then in 1976, there's Blake McKelvey's Rochester, which is a 1-hour WXXI program where you literally hear and see Blake McKelvey. And so he's trying to take this wealth of information, he's constantly trying to make it more and more and more and more and more accessible. And I think of how forbidding that 4-book series is for a reader in Rochester who wants to know about their city. And then how serviceable that 1 volume is. And then how maybe unserviceable that 1-hour TV special is he's gone too far and he's boiled it down too much. And so somewhere along the spectrum between a 4-volume set and a 1-hour special maybe lies the right amount of content. But the right amount of content for what? And it was wonderful to hear about your work as a teacher here in Rochester, in the Rochester schools. And the sense I got was that you looked to that 1 volume as a kind of index. There's no, almost like a Wikipedia kind of Rochester history, and that you could look to the index to connect the New Deal with what was happening here, or to look at the Great Society and what was happening here, or the progressive era, all these movements that are kind of McKelvey focuses on so much. And I think of that indexing function and how different it is from a biography, in the sense that a biography is not only a chronicle of a life, it attempts to make sense of the person. And so if it's an index, it's a big encyclopedia with every entry. And McKelvey was criticized as his 4th volume, the marketing copy for it said, 1,000 persons are named. And one of the reviewers said, that means he did this incorrectly, because he's listing names, and that might be good to see your name in print if you're one of those 1,000 people. But how does that help us make sense of the thing, rather than just list and chronicle? And so there's a tension between this indexing function that you point to, which has value, but then his larger sense-making biographical aim of pulling it all together and giving us an interpretation of what Rochester has been, in addition to a chronicle, a list of what Rochester has been. But one of the things I think your anecdote points to that is really useful about being able to go to this index and then to tell your students, this building that you walk by, this park that you play in, this school that you learn in, it's part of history. And it's part of local history, but it's also part of American history more broadly. And the things we're learning about in this textbook, or for the exam, they may seem really depersonalized to you, and they may seem at a remove from your life. But look, they're part of the building we're in. They're part of the sewer system that we use. they're part of all these things that's history from the bottom up for sure. And so I think that McKelvey believed that history shouldn't be although his works often lent themselves to this, history is not a potted plant. That history is not over and done with and back there. That we are in a temporal continuum in which the past, present, and the future are all on that continuum. And the past is not sealed off from the present, and the future is continuous with the present. And we're also in a spatial continuum, where what's happening in Rochester is related to the Great Lakes Basin and the Erie Canal Basin and the global system of trade and migration and movement. And so he wants to take our local lives and ask us to think of them in these larger contexts, these spatial and temporal continuum. And then when we have that awareness, we say to ourselves, I'm a creature of history as well. I'm a product of history. I'm in it right now. And then I think this was the most important third piece. What comes next? And how does knowing that I'm a creature of history and knowing that this building I learned in this sewer system that I benefit from is all part of these historical structures, how does that awareness make me act different? And so that's fundamentally a different approach to the past than going there for something that is quaint and interesting. It's a political approach to the past. Unfortunately, however, McKelvey's texts aren't actually, political conflict is not very visible in them. And so he has these ambitions, but these ambitions don't match what we actually see in these more receipt-keeping lists of names and things that he actually offers us.
I just was wondering if, like in certain periods of time, was there certain periods of times he seemed to write more than others, just like specific events or periods of times that seemed to excite him more? I don't know if you noticed that or not. I mean, is that true or not? Like there's certain events where there's just more data, more information, more excitement that were happening. Was there certain areas throughout history, you know, in his lifetime that he was writing about it, or he kind of keyed in a little bit more on, you know, instead of like kind of just, you know, lightly passing over stuff because there wasn't enough data or enough research, enough information on it? Was there certain periods of his life where it just kind of just resonated with him that, oh, I got to write this, I have to talk about this, I have to, you know, I have to interpret this, I have to, you know, there's just so much excitement about it that seemed to kind of drive him a little bit more than other subjects? Were there any events or anything that he kind of like elaborated on more?
I don't know if I have a good and reliable answer to your question, so I would ask others to provide theirs. It seems to me that not coincidentally, the events that overlap with his own lifetime are the ones that he writes about quite a bit. And Jean McKelvey, his wife, was a towering figure as well, who was involved in labor relations and the Cornell School of Industrial and Labor Relations. And McKelvey was very closely connected, I think, ideologically and through Jean to reform movements and to mobilizing for reform. And so you see a lot of problems and responses modeling in it. The problem of industrialization and Rochester's response to it, the problem of mobilization for the First World War and Rochester's response to it, the problem of mobilizing to meet the exigencies of the Great Depression and Rochesterians' responses to it. So these kind of mobilizations, whether for some economic challenge or war, are where he seems to have the most wind in his sails, perhaps because of that personal set of connections, but also because I think he is shaped by the progressive era and the idea that the community mobilizing to address a problem is very much his model of democracy, and he calls that the historian's faith, a kind of self-directed community. All of which makes the many kinds of mobilizations that he overlooks or attends to not at all, or the problems and responses that he doesn't address, all the more glaring for his stated intention to focus precisely on those things. The other question is, who's doing the responding to these problems? And though we're talking about history from the bottom up, it's often Mrs. Harper Sibley is a main character. And so elites who organize a meeting of other elites to address these problems. And you might say, well, this is Smugtown, USA. That's empirically accurate that there's an establishment in Rochester that did a lot. But I think that empirical claim can be contested. And it undermines this whole getting away from the drum and trumpet history. I mean, maybe we're not talking about national elites, but there's a lot about Rochester elites. And so how is that not drum and trumpet history fitted to the scale of a city? That's a question that if Blake McKelvey were here, I would pose to him.
Oh, and I'd like to take this opportunity to give a shout out to the amazing public library website that has the index of Rochester History Journal articles going back decades and decades. Every time I've perused it, I've found like so many stories, most of them written by Blake McKelvey, that I want to follow up on. He was indeed really good at using current events as hooks and historical anniversaries. For example, he wrote an article about the role of Rochester in a bunch of World's Fairs, probably right after like the 1964 World's Fair in New York City. But yeah, that's a tremendous resource that was only relatively recently done due to a grant and the effort of people here to get those funds to do that indexing.
I also forgot to say that I think Blake McKelvey's Rochester movie will become available now through Rochester History. Is that right?
I believe it's already available online. Is that correct, Emily? Yes, it's already available online. It was actually put up there by McKelvey's successor's brother. His successor, Dr. Barnes, has passed away, but his brother put it up online, and we've also included it in the digital edition of Rochester History. So if you're a subscriber, you actually also have access to the digital edition, so you'll find it there as well. And, you know, just to back up or get back to what Tom was asking, you know, I think Michael hit it right on the nose. But, you know, one of the things that is a little unique and interesting about McKelvey is that throughout his career, he does end up writing about things that are happening in Rochester during his lifetime. He also was very much a player in local activities. He served on all sorts of commissions and boards and really was involved in the local politics, not so much as a politician himself, but he was actively engaging with everything that was happening, you know, around him in the community. And so, you know, in some ways I would argue that he did become very much an activist historian during those latter parts of his career as well, which certainly affects the lens through which he's viewing history.
So I hear the term, you know, history tends to repeat itself. Is there anything that's repeating itself from Rochester history?
That's a really great question. Oh, I mean, I think the answer is definitely yes. Coming up with specific examples is a little difficult, although the one that's coming to my mind right now is, throughout Rochester's history, we see a strong influence by local businesses. The Chamber of Commerce, in particular, was driving so much of what happened in Rochester, particularly in the early 20th century, in terms of, it was the Chamber of Commerce who was developing plans for Rochester's downtown and how the community could be developed. And so I think we are very much a city that has been heavily driven by business interests, and I think that remains very true. I mean, everything from, the local businesses who have been pushing for the bid, which has been opposed by other factions in the state that might be more focused on citizen engagement. A lot of the development that's taking place is driven by the business community, so I'd say that is definitely something that, maybe isn't repeating, but that is continuing in the way we address life and politics in the city.
One of the things that occurs to me relates to Christine's point about McKelvey not having water blindness, being very attentive to the role of water. He shows that approaches to water can be political questions, such as the various competing early settlements before the dominance of Rochester as the main settlement on the Genesee. And they're located at different proximities to the lake and to the falls and at different points in the river and the rapids, and how the trade embargo during the Jefferson administration in the context of the Napoleonic Wars leads to all this kind of smuggling on Lake Ontario, and how the War of 1812 as a combat theater on Lake Ontario ends up shaping a lot of the destiny of the settlements in the Genesee and Rochester. So he's connecting water resources to politics, and that it's the interaction of water resources and politics that has been with us for a long time. The choosing of the route for the Erie Canal is another signal example of this. And today I'm thinking about Rock the Riverway, a massive public-private partnership to develop our riverfront here in downtown, just outside, in a new and different way. And how contested that is, in that there are folks who would like to see the Erie Canal brought back into downtown. There are folks who would like to see Broad Street Bridge turned into a pedestrian and bike zone. There are others who highlight the graffiti art that is in what is also known as the abandoned subway and don't want that to be overlooked. And then there are others who say, that area has been a shelter for people who don't have shelter. And what are we going to do about that? The idea of climate refugees coming to Rochester because of our access to fresh water. The regulation of the levels of water in Lake Ontario and its outflows through the St. Lawrence in the event of springtime flooding. So water and politics flow together, and McKelvey would want us to learn that about our past, to be clear-eyed about that with respect to our present, as we head into a future where that may become more acutely the case.
Okay. I'd like to go back to the idea of what kinds of history are useful. And I think that the kinds of history that link what's going on today with the way things were treated, and I'm thinking specifically of immigrants. And we us to feel that it is something that is new, and to be caught up in all of the pain around that. And I think what history can do is to help us look back at the nativist movement and what happened to those folks, and what it can show us for now. One of the, I don't remember whether this is in McKelvey, but I remember reading about Bishop McKelvey and him growing up in New Jersey at a time when the Know-Nothings were very prominent, and his parish church was burned down. And when he became the first bishop of Rochester, he pushed very hard for a separate school system, so that immigrants who were pouring in would be served without prejudice. And knowing that those kinds of things happen, how those anti-immigrants sentiments were expressed and what happened, I think is a very useful thing for us to know about, hear about. I would love to see, I still read the newspaper, but I would love to see somewhere articles or stories about the treatment of immigrants in the 1830s and 1900s, and compared to, that's I'm just pulling that one thread of an issue, but I think that it gives us that kind of history that gives us a way to look at what's going on now is just very, very useful.
Something of a connecting thread that McKelvey called for doing research in the immigrant papers, magazines, and newspapers about those communities, but he didn't have the linguistic skills. So obviously the story of Anglo immigrants is the one that largely got told. Are there other questions? Mindy?
I will just mention that the library recently has been making a real push to digitize the non-English language newspapers, so we were hoping that having easier access to those will help to spur some of that research. No, just so you know.
So thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed all of your points. My background is in libraries and archives, and the more I learn about history, the more I'm struck by how interdisciplinary it is. And I'm just curious to know if you have a particular favorite. Like, do you gravitate toward historical archaeology, sociology, ecology?
Well, yeah, definitely. Environmental historians are very interdisciplinary. I mean, my undergraduate degree was in biology, and I wound up doing a PhD in the history of science, technology, and medicine, and I've come into environmental history since then. But yeah, I use all those different skills in order to, understand what things happened, when they did, and why they did.
My background prior to graduate school in history was political theory and philosophy. So I use those lenses to look at the past, but I'm also interested in the history of those things and how Rochesterians were debating political ideas and what kind of concepts people were using to understand the reality is quite interesting to me. And I have a notion that there is something distinctive about Rochester, that there's kind of some shared outlooks, ways of conceptualizing the world in Rochester, but it's just a faint glimmer on the horizon for me. If I was, a Blake McKelvey spending 70 years in Rochester thinking about Rochester, you'd have to talk to me in a few decades to see if I pin down what that is.
Thank you for that question. Yes, I think you hit the nail on the head. It is very interdisciplinary, and I've found, throughout my career, I've had to touch on different disciplines. So I initially came to history. My background was first as a journalist. My undergraduate degrees are journalism and also political science. I came to history coming out of journalism. One of the things that really spurred me toward additional historical research was archaeology. So I've done public archaeology and historic archaeology, mostly in New York State, which led me into my dissertation research that, ironically, for a city historian, focused on rural history, which required me to look a lot at the work of sociologists who were looking at community, how communities develop. And so, of course, I also consider myself a women's historian and a public historian. So, you're constantly kind of dipping into other fields when doing this work, I think.
This is for Dr. Ridarsky, and then kind of a second part for the others. When you accepted the mantle of your current office, how much was it still shaped like McKelvey? What fit? What felt comfortable? What stretched you? And what's satisfying to you? Kind of, if you would speak personally. And then for the others, we've talked about what who history can be useful for, but I wonder if you would also, kind of the two of you would follow on and talk about ways in which the office of a public historian is useful for academic historians in teaching or research or any other way.
Yes, thank you for that. Blake McKelvey looms large in my office, and no historian has lived up to what he has done. He has huge shoes to fill, and I am now the third since he has left, and I don't think any of us have produced at the scale that McKelvey has. I think, as we've been pointing out through the conversation, McKelvey created this wonderful framework, but it was from a very particular perspective. And so, I think a lot of what I have been doing and my predecessors have been doing was trying to fill some of those gaps and trying to explore some of the questions that he wasn't able to explore, or encourage new perspectives that might be different from the one that he has had. So, personally, I think, McKelvey's histories in the 4-volume series cut off in the 1960s, early in the 60s. I do believe there is a need to fill the period between the 60s and the present. I don't know that it's ever going to be done in the way that McKelvey has done it. I would love to come back and write that history. My volumes would look very, very different from his because, my perspective is different. The field of history has changed. Access to resources has changed. But I don't know that there's much of an audience for even a modern version of that kind of book. So, My very first few weeks on the job, I was hired late in 2008. The first thing I was confronted with was the city was preparing to celebrate its 175th anniversary in 2009. Nobody asked me to do a book, right? The first thing I was asked to do was to create a digital timeline, right? So, you know, the idea of what a historian does and how that brings that history to the community is very different now. And even now, I find some challenges between what people expect from history and historian and what, you know, my community and my government expects versus what I would like to give. In that, you know, there is, you know, especially in this world of digital media, social media, people are happy with a very superficial understanding of history. So I have to sort of find ways of walking that line between giving people some of that superficial history that, you know, I hope might spur them to engage more deeply, and then also finding ways to produce and share out some of the more in-depth forms of history and getting people to think more critically and deeply. And I'm not sure I always succeed at that because of the constraints around my work, but it is what I hope to produce at some point. And you know, I am very excited right now because this new role that I've taken on as county historian is actually allowing me to do some of that work. For years, I was also managing a department here in the library. Now I am I like to say I can act like a real historian now. So I am starting to do some of that. You know, you saw the beginnings of that with my article here. I'm working on some things with the city right now. So I'm hoping that we will see more of that. But, you know, in my own role as someone who was both serving as a historian while also managing an archive, because I've been managing the special collections, the local history division here at the library, which I've fortunately been able to pass off to someone now. It has given me, I think, a unique perspective on how those two interact. So I'm very proud of the work that the library has done, not only to preserve and increase access to the sources that have always been here, but we've really been engaged lately in trying to connect with the community and start to fill in some of the gaps, not only in the history, but in the historical record that will allow us to produce history. So the library, for example, just a couple years ago established an archive of Black history and culture, and we have been proactively trying to connect with the folks in the community whose history has not been collected, and in fact, in some cases, whose history has been deliberately erased from the record, and trying to fill in some of those gaps. So, you know, that is work that I'm particularly proud of, that I think will then enable future work by myself and others that will help to, you know, help to fill in the things that McKelvey was not able to study deeply.
Your question, how is public history valuable for academic history? That's a really important part of my evolving career. I was shocked if you saw the Democrat and Chronicle this past Monday. They reprinted my article about the Erie Canal and its environmental impacts on the front page. I wrote that for the conversation.com website, and it was definitely an activity in public history for me. It took about a month of me going back and forth with the editor. Like, she was really pushing me to clarify all kinds of issues. You know, I wouldn't say dumb it down, but I would say, like, you know, writing something in like 10 words as opposed to 75. So yeah, public historians play an incredibly important role in communicating these often kind of obscure ideas, but also long-winded ones. So for me, doing activities like that has been really important in making me a better teacher also as well. So that article also was in a way inspired by reading Blake McKelvey's take on the Erie Canal.
I think Christine used the metaphor of a bridge between a municipal historians who work at universities, and I think our side of the bridge is in jeopardy. The Ivory Tower has taken several trebuchet projectiles into it, and we must be public historians, urgently so. Because we have, I think, an obligation to publics, because publics are a way for us to learn and expand our perspectives, but also because the model of being holed up in the Ivory Tower isn't aging very well. And I think more and more of us are crossing the bridge over to where we meet folks like Christine. And that's why local history and the history of Rochester is such a common ground. That's kind of the middle of the bridge, because we're all here in Rochester together with the amazing research resources around us that Christine and Emily and others help us access, they compile, and they themselves work with as scholars. And so that kind of McKelveyan mission of being historians of Rochester, in Rochester, involved, I think is more pressing now for us who work at universities, maybe trained, as Bruce was describing, in a model that is under duress for reasons, for sake of its own flaws as well as by virtue of external forces.
Thank you very much. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I must confess I hadn't even thought about history in the various guises as you have put it right now. I'm a neophyte to the study of the history of Rochester. I'm a neophyte to the study of history, other than what one absorbs by living. So one of the things that I really am very impressed by is your concept, think critically and deeply. Now that in itself is obviously what McKelvey did, a name I hasten to point out that meant absolutely nothing to me until about 2 weeks ago. But you pointed out that this is a multifaceted approach to understanding Rochester as a sociological entity. Now, that is one view of the elephant that he has put forward in from multiple different viewpoints, of course. But at the end of the day, if you're looking at the head, you don't have the elephant properly until you look at the tail. And so I'm going to put you on the spot, if you don't mind, distinguished panelists. What if I was to say to you, in a way that I am trying to get a greater overall understanding, conflict tends to be the best way to determine where you need to start expanding your view. So, I would like you to tell me, to the direct question, Blake McKelvey was a great historian with a single viewpoint of history. I disagree with, in particular, this view that he promulgates.
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot to disagree with McKelvey about. You know, I would argue, I consider myself a social historian and a public historian, and I think it's important to look from the bottom up. We have one of the highest poverty rates in New York State. We still suffer as a community greatly from racism, and I think that I'm not sure that McKelvey's work gives us much that would help us to understand how we got to those places in terms, McKelvey did focus very much on sort of the movers and shakers in the community and on the progressive efforts, the middle class efforts to improve the city, where he does talk about, as Michael was talking about, the solutions to the problems. The focus very much is on sort of the white middle class perception of what the problems are and their maternalistic or paternalistic approaches to solving those problems. We don't get much of a view of how the people being affected by those problems viewed the problems and how they themselves sought to go about solving or addressing those problems. So I think that is where I see the biggest weaknesses in McKelvey's arguments and where I think the most work is needed in order to more fully understand the whole. Again, there is no singular whole, but to get a more nuanced perspective on Rochester's history and how that relates to us today.
It's a great question, well asked. I'll read to you a few sentences just to make sure I get it right. McKelvey, in his 4th volume on Rochester, pointed out that, quote, although Rochester won the first World Brotherhood Award in June 1958, it could not hide some shameful shortcomings, particularly the ugly fact of racial segregation in the city, where a state survey found a greater reluctance to sell to Negroes in some of Rochester's better neighborhoods than in any state, any city in the state. However, I agree with that statement of the problem and highlighting that problem, as Christine pointed out. However, McKelvey recurred to a formulation that personified Rochester, a pitfall of urban biography that suggests the false analogy between an individual life and a complex, multifarious city, when he wrote, awaking at last to its responsibilities, Rochester began with hesitation and then with greater assurance to suppress its discriminatory impulse. Such a sentence creates the impression of smooth consensus, where there was in fact deep conflict. Suppress its discriminatory impulse. That sentence clearly identifies Rochester with white Rochesterians, for surely it was not black Rochesterians who had a discriminatory impulse against themselves.
Oh, and my point is similar. I disagree with Blake McKelvey's environmental determinism. So that's the idea that geography, climate, and other environmental features play strong roles in human and societal development. So it sounds okay on the surface, but then when you look more deeply, you can see that there's often like a quite racist dimension to that story, or that approach. So one of his quotes was, the experience of successive human invasions on the Upper Genesee landscape was to demonstrate that the site had been so designed as to attract only an advanced commercial and industrial settlement, such as the New York migrants of the early 19th century were to build. So yeah, I look into that very problematic statement in some more detail.
Well, my gosh, the time has flown. We're almost to noon, and I think for all his weaknesses, certainly McKelvey left us with an amazing base from which to operate, and proof that I guess that his history really matters, and maybe someone will write that 5th volume, Christine. be your job. Let's thank our panel for a stimulating morning. And I'm sure our panelists will be delighted to talk with you afterwards with the questions you didn't get to ask. But thank you so much again for coming. As Michael said, on a beautiful sunny Saturday. I guess it really speaks well for Rochester. Thank you, and have a good day.
And don't forget, if you're not already a subscriber to Rochester History Journal, please stop back and see us at the back table. Thank you.